Okay, guys, so now we start talking about community detection, which is where we actually go into the algorithms and the details about how to extract such patterns from the graphs, from graphs and networks in general. It's important to remember that we will work with undirected and unweighted networks. So this is, let's say, a simple subset of the possible available networks out there. Many times you will actually find yourself with at least weighted networks. It's very common to have weights on the edges, so you have some kind of a measure of importance on them, right? That you have gathered from your data or that you assume to be the case. And not so common, but also common is to have directed networks where the edges only go one way or the other. So in those cases, you either fall back to the simplest case in order to apply these algorithms, or you just convert them somehow, if it makes sense. Or you just, of course, or you go and search for other algorithms that will actually deal with directed or weighted networks, which are not going to be covered in our case, but they exist also. Especially with directed networks, it becomes a little bit harder because let's say a directed network has a much less trivial or obvious model, let's say, in terms of real life, or even if you think about Euclidean space, right? Because something that can only go one way and not the other, like 2 points that have a connection that only works one way, it's not something that's very easy to deal with, to distance measures and things like that, right? Because the common case is that if there's a distance from A to B, then it's the same distance from B to A. That's usually what we assume to be the case. And so these algorithms, they work like that. So in those other cases, you have to either fall back to the, just ignore the directions, for example, or ignore the weights, or use different algorithms. The first method that we're going to talk about is based on what's called the strength of weak ties. Of course, what is a weak tie, right? Basically, you can consider that when an edge is connecting two different communities, considering this idea that we have of communities, these ties are, let's say, weaker than ties that are inside a community. So you kind of assume that these ties, let's say, if you break them, you end up, you're not breaking the structure of the communities in general, right? You're actually breaking the, let's say, you're breaking the connections between the communities, right? Which is, in a way, depending on the kind of abstraction that you're using, can actually be considered the most important paths in the graph, right? Because it could be that these paths, they are actually connecting areas that are far away from each other. And so if you, let's say, so to speak, sever these ties, then you're basically leaving large parts of the graph either unconnected or at least with a smaller, let's say, bandwidth of flow between them, right? But at the same time, so there's these two kind of interpretations that you can have. They are weak because they don't really represent, let's say, close ties, but at the same time they're important because they're connecting different parts, different groups of the graph, right? But let's say we consider them as, at this point, as weak ties, and one of the ways that you can kind of compare these two things is by, well, we, in this case, we're going to use this concept of edge betweenness, right? This is the number of shortest paths passing over the edge. We're going to talk a lot about betweenness in the next few slides, but suffice to say right now that an edge with high betweenness, that means that there's a lot of paths that are going through that edge. Again, we're not talking about like dynamics of networks or anything. So I'm not saying that necessarily there's like information being exchanged in this edge, but in a theoretical way, if you consider shortest paths between different nodes from different parts of the graphs, there's a lot of these paths that are going through these edges, right? For example, take a look at this on the left here, the edge strength call volume in a real network. So this is a measured, uh, let's say, information flow between computers in a network, right? So you can see that small edges, the red ones, are all like local small edges because that's where most of the traffic is actually flowing back and forth, right? In computers that are inside, let's say, subnetworks, most of the traffic is in there. And then when you see these long edges that kind of connect different, let's say, different subnetworks, they are not really that strong. You can see that some of them are like yellow, and these yellows edges are a bit weaker, right? In terms of the actual measured information flow. But on the other hand, if you compute this thing called the edge betweenness, then you see that most of them, most of the red ones are the long ones, right? So it's nice to kind of keep in mind these two interpretations of it. So these edges, they have high betweenness because if you consider any node, for example, if you take this red edge here, if you take any node from this part of the graph and then you take any node from another part of the graph, then every path between them, every theoretical path, even it may or may not be actually used in practice, so to speak. We don't care about that right now. We only care about the theoretical ones. So the theoretical paths between any node from this side to any node from this side goes through this edge. And that's why it has high edge betweenness, this measurement of edge betweenness. So that's you can think of it as if you cut this edge away, if this path here is cut, then this entire subnetwork here would be completely isolated from the rest of the graph. And that's how important this edge is, right? In theory. So I mean, so you have this concept of this, and then you have to think, well, how do you actually compute this, right? And how do you come to this value of edge betweenness? And it's actually, there's an algorithm. It's not the simplest thing in the world, but we will go through it. I will walk you through it. Of course, it's one of those cases where you say, well, of course, there's an algorithm for edge betweenness in any kind of a network library out there that you could find. Yes, of course, but it's interesting to analyze the algorithm and to understand how it works, because that's important for you as students in this course. And this paper from Jervan Newman is a very seminal paper in the area that discussed edge betweenness, and then based on the edge betweenness, it discusses a method for finding communities, right? Because in this case, the communities are going on cutting these edges. So the first step is to actually compute this edge betweenness, which is, so basically it's a divisive hierarchical clustering of edge betweenness. We're going to compute the edge betweenness for all these edges. It's the summary of the algorithm is over here. You calculate the betweenness of edges. You know that value that we saw here. So this kind of like the color that we're putting in these edges here. We're going to compute that, and then we're going to remove edges with highest betweenness, and then repeat until no edges are left. This is very very similar to the kinds of hierarchical clustering algorithms that we saw in the actual clustering lecture. Like, for example, the hierarchical algorithm that we saw, the first one or second one after k-means. I don't know if you saw it before k-means or after that. But it's a bit like, it's the opposite in a way, if you think about it, because what we saw there is that we started with every point in its own cluster. So we had like n clusters. And then at every step, we would merge points into clusters, right? And then slowly we build up the dendrogram until we have just one cluster at the root of the dendrogram. In this case, we're doing the opposite. We're starting from the graph as a fully connected, let's say, community, right? And then we're slowly cutting the edges that have high betweenness so that we kind of isolate these communities as we go. And then you end up having more and more clusters. So instead of having like less and less clusters, as we had before, we start with one, and then we gradually get more and more and more clusters. And when I say clusters, I actually mean communities, right? Because it's more or less the same thing, but for networks. And it's actually connected components are communities. Connected components are simply isolated parts of the graph. Okay. When you have a certain graph and it has two parts that are isolated and that are not connecting to each other in any way, then these are called connected components. And you may think, well, then that's just simply two graphs, right? In a way, yes, or maybe not. It depends. That's completely conceptual. You can just take a few connected components and just say, look, this is a graph, because conceptually they fit together. They came from the same measurement or something, but they're simply not connected. And then you call them connected components of one graph. And this gives a hierarchical decomposition of the network, because the communities that you get them, they're always sub-communities of existing communities. So the first time that you break away a certain community, then that means that you broke one big community into two communities. And the next time that you remove an edge and then you cut away again to new communities, or you get two new communities, these are also sub-communities of an existing community. So it's a hierarchical decomposition. So let's see very quickly a simple example here. This is, of course, a very artificial graph that is supposed to have 4 clear communities, right? This one, this one, this one, and this one. And they're connected by 2 dots, two nodes here, and 1 edge, right? And the first thing we do is to compute the betweenness of some of the edges. I mean, I'm not gonna calculate the betweenness of all edges here, because they're basically the same, right? So we don't need to show the betweenness of all edges, because, for example, this edge has this betweenness, and this, and this, and this, and this. They will have the same betweenness because they are basically exactly the same, right? The graph is completely symmetrical, both in the x-axis and the y-axis in this case of the drawing. So we don't need to compute everything. But what's important here is to see how the betweenness of this edge here is by far the largest one. And then this one is a little bit low, and then lower, and then lower. And it kind of fits this idea that we create in our minds of what it means to have high betweenness. So basically, the name is also very informative, right? Betweenness, like this edge is between a lot of nodes. If you consider the graph as a whole, and if you consider all possible paths between all pairs of nodes, an edge with high betweenness means it's between a lot of nodes. And this edge in the middle here is definitely between a lot of nodes, because it goes all possible shortest paths between every node from this side to this side, and vice versa. They must go through this edge. And then, since it's the one edge with the highest betweenness, the first thing we're going to do is we cut it, because that's the first step of the algorithm. We take the one edge with the highest betweenness, and then we just cut it. And in this case, we happen to, since it was, of course, a very artificial algorithm or data set, we just happen to, just by taking one step, we happen to have 2 different communities isolated from each other. And if our goal was to break this graph into 2 communities, that's it. Do anything else, because you have 2 communities, and according to this algorithm, this is the best way possible to cut this graph into 2. and that's all you need. But of course, if you need more clusters, then you're going to start cutting other edges. So for example, as we saw before, the next edges with height between is after the one in the middle were the ones that were connecting the triangles to, let's say, to the center of the graph. So, and all of them have the same between is 33. Well, it used to be 33. Now it's actually changed, but they're still the same. And that's a good point, because right now this was 33, right? Because what does that mean? It means that if I take all these triangles, these nodes from here, and then I compute the shortest paths from these 3 nodes to every other node of the graph, I get 33, because it goes not only down here, but it also goes up here and down here. Now, of course, after I cut this, then this is not the same, because the paths that were going this way and then going up and then going down, they don't exist anymore, right? All that exists is this one isolated to one side, the other one isolated to the other. So you have to recompute all the betweenness every step, which is not really that efficient, to be honest. This algorithm was seminal, it was important, but as we will see as we go, this is not really that efficient, because it really requires a lot of processing power. So then we recompute these betweenness, and then we find out that these 4 edges, they basically have the same betweenness. So you could either cut all of them and then get 4 communities like this, or you could cut, let's say, one of them at random. Because if some edge, if more than one edge has the same betweenness, then basically it means you know that the impact is the same. Whichever one that you cut is going to end up, let's say, contributing the same amount of to the modularity of, or to the quality, so to speak, of the communities that you obtain, because basically they have the same impact. So in this case, we just cut all of them, then we get 4 communities that are, let's say, equivalently modular. And then the next step, of course, is to cut all the other ones, because then all the other ones have exactly the same betweenness, so it doesn't really matter which one you cut. And finally, if you want to see this as a dendrogram or just as a hierarchical network decomposition, then this is what you would have, because the first time you cut, you broke it down into 2 big communities, so there's 2 big circles, and then inside these big circles, you also cut, and you got these smaller communities, and then after that it's just individual nodes. So these are the individual nodes, let's say, are the leaves of this dendrogram. And basically that's it. There's not much else. The question of exactly how to do it in terms of how to compute the betweenness, right? Because we know we have the general skeleton of the algorithm, which is simply take the edge with the highest betweenness, remove it, or take all of the edges with the highest betweenness and remove them, and whatever you have after that, if you have if you manage to cut that into 2 components, then you have your communities, or else you keep cutting until you have them. This is the skeleton of the algorithm, and we will take a look at how to actually compute the betweenness. But this is just an example of the kind of results you would get from doing that, right? And these are communities in physics collaborations. These authors, they usually use these collaboration networks because, you know, they know about it. They understand it, because it's something that they are living it with all the time. So they can look at a graph like this. We can look at a graph like this, and we see that it kind of makes sense, I guess. I mean, I don't know the authors, of course, that are in this collaboration network, because it's in physics, but we can see that more or less in terms of the spatial configuration of the nodes, and in terms of how the specific layout algorithm has you know, draw these nodes, it kind of feels like it makes sense, right? You can see that in some places they mix up, like here, for example, but or here, but most of the time they're more or less isolated into their own corners. And that kind of means that these authors, they collaborate a lot with each other and not that much with authors from other research groups. So basically this usually means that research groups or people who, or different research groups in the same country, for example, that usually collaborate with each other and so on. So it's kind of what you would expect from an algorithm like this. And this is also a very classical example of this Zachary's karate club. You have gotten this one as one of the data sets that I have used as an example for your weekly exercise. And you can see the results. Well, you can see the results there, but you can also see the results here, which look quite interesting, because this is the kind of network where we actually know, or we have some information about how it should be partitioned into two, because of the story behind the data set and how this karate club was split into two at some point due to internal differences and things like that. So we know which were the two, let's say, which were the members that ended up into these two groups after it split. And then when you take the graph, and this graph actually represents interactions between groups of these clubs. I don't remember exactly how they were measured, but basically they measure like people that knew each other and that used to talk to each other a lot or something like this. And so they created these edges. And then at some point, this karate club split into two, because the two guys like had a fight, and another guy opened another club or something like this. I don't remember exactly. I can give you a link to look at it later, but it's some story like this. And then after this happened, we know who stayed in the actual club and who went to the new club. So if we look at the graph before this happened, and we try to predict that, to say, let's predict what would happen if we split this group into two, then basically you would see here from the dendrogram that most of the squares here, one group is a square and the other group is circles, right? The labels. So you can see that most of the squares ended up in this group. There's just one did not, and most of the circles ended up in this group. So it's an almost perfect partition, which is kind of neat. Now, of course, then the next thing you have to think about is, well, how to compute betweenness, how to actually label these, let's say, label these edges by how many paths, shortest paths are between them. And I mean, this computing shortest paths in general, it's not the most complicated thing in the world, especially if you're considering unweighted and undirected graphs. Still, since we have to compute all of them, not just one, then it gets a little bit more complicated, because usually you just compute one shortest path between two nodes, and that's it. You don't need any more, because that's the shortest. Why would you care if there were more other paths with the same, let's say, length, right? Usually you don't care. But in this case, we actually have to compute all of them. So it gets a little slightly more complicated, but I will walk through the process here just so you guys have an idea of what it takes to compute such things. And actually, this is a very interesting exercise into just understanding how a graph processing works in general. We're going to start with this node here. Not this node, sorry. With this graph here. And I'm sorry, but there's a problem here. I just realized that I actually changed some stuff in the slides, but this should be E, and this should be E, and not A, because we're starting from E and not from A. I'm gonna actually fix this very quickly, because why not? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to actually compute betweenness of paths starting at node E. Now, we have to do this for all of them, okay? This is the first part where you can see that it gets kind of complicated. The process that I'm going to show you is only starting from one node E. But you actually have to do that starting from all nodes, because every time you start from a different node, you get different shortest paths. You get the shortest paths from that node to every other node in the graph or in the network. And there's no way to kind of like compare that or to have that information if you don't actually go through all of the nodes at least once, or not go through, but like focus on each node at least once. So this process that I'm going to show you here, you have to actually repeat that for every node in the graph. So it requires a lot of processing power. Now the first thing we do is a breadth first search starting from E. And I also realized there's a typo here because there's missing a D here, but I won't really fix that now. So breadth first search starting from E. Now, what's a breadth first search? This is something kind of like a basic algorithm for graphs, right? That you will see, for example, in visualization or in many other places. A breadth first search basically means I start from E, which is because I chose to start from E. I could have started from A, B, C, doesn't matter, because I have to do this for all of them. I start from E, and then I say, okay, what are all the neighbors of E? Well, the neighbors of E are D and F, right? So I kind of like add D and F to the first level. These two nodes are the first level of nodes that are reachable from E, right? I can reach D and I can reach F directly. So basically, the shortest path between E and D is 1. And the shortest path between F is also 1. And that's why they are on level 1. Every node that is in the same level basically has the same length of the shortest path to E, right? So both D and F are one edge away from E. So they are in the first level, okay? D and F. And you see that there is an edge between D and F here that you should ignore that edge. You should disregard this edge because this edge does not contribute anything. Since the shortest path from E to D is 1 and from E to F is also 1, then this edge basically means that any path that goes here like this or like this has length through 2, and that is larger than the shortest path, so it doesn't matter. So just consider that any edge that goes between nodes on the same level, that should be completely disregarded. You can act as if it doesn't exist. And now we keep doing that from level 1 to level 2. So now I say, okay, from D, I can reach, well, I can reach F, but that doesn't matter. I can reach G and I can reach B. So G and B will go to level 2. And then again, for F, I can reach G. So I also add a connection here from F to D. And I can also reach D, but again, that doesn't matter. And with that, we have established level 2. So now we have B on level 2 because it's reachable from D, and we have G on level 2 because it's reachable from both D and F. And then we keep going. In this case, it means from B I can reach A and I can reach C. So A and C go to level 3. And the edge between A and C is disregarded. And so we have built this, what we call this direct acyclic graph. It's not a tree. It kind of looks like a tree, but it's not a tree because in a tree you couldn't have a node like this one, G, with 2 parents. That's not allowed in a tree. And so that's interesting because you know, when we talk about genealogical trees, they're not actually trees because some nodes, well, every node has 2 parents, at least in theory. So that's not really a genealogical tree, it's a genealogical directed acyclic graph, but I guess that name doesn't sound as nice. That abstraction is not a good one. But basically we got this, we do the breadth first search starting from me, and we got this DAG, or this DAG as we call sometimes, direct acyclic graph. And now the next thing is that we are actually going to count the number of shortest paths from, again, from E to all the other nodes of the network. So again, I'm going to actually fix this very quick. I don't think it's a problem. From E, yeah. So count the number of shortest paths from E to all other nodes of the network. How do we do this? Well, we do it by going top down in our DAG or in our DAG, starting from E and then going level by level. So we label each node by the number of shortest paths that reach it from the root. Start by labeling the root 1. So basically just E is 1. Now go to the next level from top down. Label each node Y, let's call each node here Y, by the sum of labels of its parents. Now, D only has one parent, which is E, so it gets 1 because the sum of its parents is 1. And F also only has one parent, so it gets 1 because the parent is 1. And then as we move down to level 2, we have G, which has two parents, 1 and 1, and then G gets a label that is equal to the sum of the labels of its parents, 1 and 1. And then B just have one parent, so 1. A and C also has one parent, 1, 1. So that's very trivial in this case. And only G is a little bit different, which we must keep in mind. So we go top down. Okay, that's pretty simple so far. Just kind of label the nodes, assign a label to the nodes, and the only one here that's different is actually G. And that's it. As soon as you got to the last level, you stop and you save this until you go to the next step. And now we go to the next step, which is to actually compute betweenness. And the way that we will compute betweenness is by going back up. So first we started from the top and we went all the way down. And now we're going to go down and go back up. So we'll start from the bottom until we get to node E, right? And the first thing that we do is each leaf in the duck gets a credit of 1. Now, credit is not the same as a label. These are, I mean, we had to give them two names. So the first, in this case, we are labeling the number of shortest paths. Right? This is one thing. And now we're going to start to assign credit. This is another thing, all right? The labels are going to be used in a certain way, but now we're talking about credits. So we start from the bottom. We take each leaf a credit of 1. So A and C simply get a credit of 1. Okay, now the second step is after we are leaving the leaves, we have the credit of 1 in the leaves. And now we're going to take, let's say instead of going all the way to the second level here, we're going to take like a half step. And we're going to stop at the edges. And then we're going to give the edges some credit also. And the credit of the edges, as it's described here in step 2, each edge here gets a share of the credit of the node. So in this case, I say node Z. In this case, let's say Z is actually A, right? Z is just like a variable name. And so if we're on node A, then the edge that is going into A here is actually going to get a credit that's proportional to the parent's contribution among all parents of Z. But in this case, since A only has one parent, then the edge here gets full credit, which is 1, because the credit of A is 1. So the edge gets 1. If A had more parents, then we would split the credit of A between the edges according to the parent's contribution, which is what's going to happen with G here. So with A is like this, and then C is also like this because C is 1, only has one parent, so it gets 1. And then step number 3 is that each node that is not a leaf, so now we're on B here, gets a credit of 1. So you always start with 1 as the baseline, plus the sum of the credits of the edges from that node to the level below. So since there's one edge here that's 1 and another here that's also 1, then this gets to 3. 1 plus 1 plus 1. 1 for the node itself and 1 for each edge. Right? And then we keep doing that. Like for example, this is trivial. The edge gets 3 because B only has one parent, so it gets the same credit as the edge gets the same credit as B. But then with G is a little bit more interesting because G has 1, right? Because G is a leaf, and each leaf in the dot gets a credit of 1. So G gets 1. Now, the thing is that G has 2 parents, right? So somehow the credit of G has to be split between the edges. And each edge here is getting 0.5, and that's because D and F contribute equally because both have label 1. If you take a look at this previous slide, E has a label of 1 and F has a label of 1. So they get 0.5 and 0.5, the both edges. Now, unfortunately, in this graph here, we don't have a more complex example, but if that was the case, like for example, if D had a label of 2 and F had a label of 1, let's say, then the edges here would actually like, this edge here would get double the amount of points or credits than this one here, right? And because in this case, D, let's say, would contribute more than F, would contribute 2 and F would contribute 1. So the edge that links G to D would have to be also, let's say, double credits than the other one. And then just keeps going up, right? So D gets a 1 point because every node gets 1 point, plus 3 plus 0.5, so that's 4.5. And F gets 1 point plus 0.5, so that's 1.5, and so on and so forth. And after we finish this, have then the betweenness here of each of these edges, right? And what happens is that then you just go and do the same thing, but focusing on other edges at the root here of this DAG. So you repeat, I mean, in this case, you would repeat it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more times. So you would do it 7 times in total. And then at the end, the edges would get like the whole sum of all the credits that they got from each of the runs that you did. So you would like loop over them and do it. And this is how you would determine the betweenness of the edges. And by determining the betweenness, you would then be able to compute the modularity of this algorithm-driven Newman. Because again, like we looked before, the whole thing is just a hierarchical divisive algorithm. So you start with one full network, fully connected, compute all the, let's go back to that. Compute all the betweenness, remove the edges with the highest betweenness until you get a split. So you get a one, let's say, community gets split from the other, and then you keep doing that, and every time you get a split, you have a new community, right? So you just keep removing the edges, but it's important that at every step you have to recompute the betweenness. And that's it, basically. That's the, let's say, the naive, as we say, algorithm, right? And one question here would be, as always, right? After you've done this, and after you've been able to compute this full dendrogram of hierarchical communities, then the next natural question is usually how you choose the number of communities that you want to have. And again, that's the same problem as we had before. I mean, it's never, you know, some data sets have very clear communities, some data sets don't have very clear communities. So it's just a matter of trying to find a good one that represents that data set, right? When it comes to network communities, even though we do have, for example, we have that the measure of silhouette when we're talking about clusters, right? And in communities, we have this very famous, let's say, the most well-known, most well-used metric, which is the modularity Q. Was proposed also by Newman. Newman was this guy who just revolutionized network research about like 15 years ago, or a little bit more. So they define this, in this case, it's Jervin and Newman, but Newman is this figure behind all these papers. And they define this modularity Q. That's a measure of how well a network is partitioned into communities. So the higher the Q, the better is the partitioning, right? And given a certain partitioning of the network into groups as, so let's say communities, right? I don't know how to call this groups here, but communities. Then the modularity is basically a sum over all communities of the number of the edges that are within the group or within the community, right? So these edges over here and these edges over here and these edges over here, if we move through the three communities and loop over them, then you have the number of the edges that are within them minus a certain expected number of edges within the group. Now, so this needs a little bit of working, right? And we say this needs a null model. What does it mean that it needs a null model? We need to have a number here that we say, look, this is what we would expect from a completely random network. So if this was if this network was let's say totally randomly generated, so that there were no clear community structure, then this is how many edges we would expect to have within this specific group. So it's like it's a way to say, like, look, how far away are we from random in this point? So that's why we take the number of edges that are actually within the group minus the number that we would expect in a random situation. And do you remember when we discussed all the way in the beginning, when I did the introduction of the course, that in data mining we're always looking for patterns. We're looking for new knowledge about the data. And patterns, I mean, even though it's very hard to determine, one way that I talked about patterns was that a pattern is something that deviates from randomness. It's something that's far away from being random. Because of course, if something is random, then you don't consider it as a pattern. It's just something that has no explanation and has no meaning. So the farther away we are from being random, the more knowledge we're gathering about this data, right? So if we find communities here, and then we realize that by splitting them, we're actually, let's say, moving very far away from a random situation, then that's a good thing. Because if it was random, that let's say if I just, if I just took this graph and just cut it randomly, then the communities would not be, let's say, meaningful, right? So basically that's the idea here. You take this computation here within each community, and then you sum it all, and then you say, okay, this is the modularity, and it's always between 0 and 1. So the closest to 1, the better. Zero would be the case when the cut is completely random, and it approximates, or if it was close to 0, it would approximate a random cut, like a random partitioning that doesn't mean anything. So that's why it would be 0, because then the edges that we actually have are very close to being the expected number of edges in a random situation. And we don't want that, of course. We want something that's very far away from that. So the farther away that we are from that, that the closer we are to being on 1, because then we have this number here, the edges within the group are larger than the expected, so the number is large. And then as you sum all communities, you go closer and closer to being 1, which is good. And this is this slide is a little bit of a formalization of this that I just explained. I'm not going to go into details here because I don't think it's that important. But as you will see here, the idea here is that in order to determine this null model, you would have to imagine a hypothetical situation when of the same graph, or in terms of not the same graph, but a graph where the nodes have the same degree. So I'm not changing the degree of the nodes. If a certain node has 3 edges, it will still have 3 edges, or if it has 2 edges, it still has 2 edges. But then I imagine this hypothetical situation where we would randomly reassign these edges all around. So like instead of I and J being connected as they were, I connect J to another node and I to another node, and then just let's say if hypothetically I randomly reassigned all these edges all around, then I would expect that the connections between two nodes would be the degree of one node times the degree of the other node divided by 2 over m. And the reason for this is that for every edge of one node, which is the degree ki, I have the probability of being connected to another node kj, because the node j has kj edges, right? So like I have 4 edges. Let's say I have 3 edges on I, and each of these 3 edges could be connected with one of these 4 edges from j. So that's why ki times kj divided by 2m, because 2m is the number of all possible edges. In this case, it's 2 times m instead of just m, because it's we're considering that each edge here has like two halves that are being cut here. Anyway, it doesn't matter too much. What matters is that you understand that the null model, so to speak, is the situation, the hypothetical situation where we would consider that these edges are completely randomly reassigned. So if we reassigned these edges randomly thousands of times, and we recomputed these let's say the modularity using the same communities that we had, then basically we would expect that the communities would not mean anything, because since we reassigned the edges all around, then the communities don't mean anything anymore. And then we consider, okay, so if we did that hypothetically, then, and it would be random, what would be the number of expected edges within the group there? And then you can just compute it theoretically, which is ki, and the degree of I times the degree of j divided by 2m for every pair of nodes. And then you can get the pair of nodes that are inside here. And then you compare that with the actual number of edges, and you say, okay, the farthest away I am from that hypothetical baseline, the better. And that's what modularity means, Q, basically. And it's a way that you can use to compute how good is your partitioning, right? And sorry, I made a mistake. I'm really, really sorry. The modularity values take range between -1 and 1, because it is positive if the number of the edges within the groups exceeds the expected number, which is what I said, right? If the number of edges within group is large, then the number of the hypothetical randomly expected number of edges within the group, then that's good, and that is a positive number. But I've said it was between 0 and 1, and it's not. It's actually between -1, because it could be that actually you did such a bad partitioning, like your partitioning is so bad, that actually the number of edges that you got is worse than random, which is really bad. So in practice, it doesn't happen a lot unless you're doing something very weird. But in practice, it doesn't really happen a lot. If even a number, a modularity number like less than 0.3 is already super bad. So you expect that a good modularity means something like more than 0.7 would be very good for the Q, right? It's not common to be negative, only if you're doing something that's really, really strange, like intentionally bad, I would say. But yeah, this is modularity, and you can see here also, and this is just another formulation that's exactly the same. So it's like you're summing over all the community. Then for all the pairs of points I and j that are inside this community, you take the connections between them. This is the adjacency. So it's either 0 or 1. If 0, it's if they're not connected, and 1 if they are connected, minus the expected number of connections that they have between them if this network was randomly rearranged. And we expect this to be it's just another formulation, but we expected this to be actually large. Yeah, normalizing costs, because we're dividing by two times n, because that's the total amount of edges. And again, this is the same thing that I just said. And why am I talking about this? Well, because actually modularity can be used as one way for you to choose where you want to cut your dendrogram. Because if you have your entire dendrogram like this, and for example, in this case, it's an artificial data set sorry, that was generated with 4 different groups, as you can see down here by the shapes of the leaves of the dendrogram. This is supposed to have four groups, right? 4 communities, and then you build this full dendrogram, and then at some point say, okay, now where should I cut, right? Where do I set the limit here? Well, if you compute, for example, here you have the modularity that's being computed for all possibilities, like all steps of your dendrogram, 0, 1, 2, 3, so on. And then you can see that there's a peak here with 4, and then it starts to go down again. So I would say that probably, well, it's very safe to assume that 4 here is the best. And we know it is, so we can check, but we can see that the peak of the modularity is in 4. And then as we keep adding clusters, let's say, or checking more and more in clusters, then it just goes down, so it doesn't matter anymore.